Our next award is the Aaron Wildavsky Award, and it's for the achievement for lifetime work in academic scholarship and budget and public finance. It's a very important award to me, of course, because I studied under Aaron and he taught me all I know. And it's a prize that I take very seriously, so I assembled a team of top Aaron Wildavsky Prize winners to determine who would receive it this year. It included Dennis Ippolito, Bart Hildreth, and Gerald Miller. The winner this year, the award goes to Philip Joyce from the University of Maryland. And Philip has a remarkable CV and list of accomplishments. It's the best moving back and forth between practitioner and scholar. He received his BA from Field College in Pennsylvania in history, and I think that historical background, maybe you'll correct me if I'm wrong, you can see it in his work, the sense of detail, timeliness, and context in his work. He received his MPA from Penn State and his PhD from Syracuse Maxwell School. He spent time as a program analyst for the State of Illinois Budget Office. Then he went to the University of Kentucky, Martin School. Then he spent, obviously, a very important time at CBO. Then to Syracuse, George Washington, and now he is at the University of Maryland. Among other things, his accomplishments include being our new co-editor of Public Budget and Finance, the leading journal in our subfield. He's the author of 22 articles, a co-author and author of 3 books, and 14 book chapters and encyclopedia entries. His books include Government Performance, Why Management Matters, published by Johns Hopkins, Public Budgeting Systems, and I think his best work, CBO, Honest Numbers, Power, and Policy Making. What informs Phil's work is a study of institutions and rules and processes and how they connect up with larger politics and the larger political system, focusing primarily at the federal budget level. His work looks at tools of the budgetary process and mechanisms such as reconciliation, line item veto, performance measures, and in the paper I'm going to look at for the next session, continuing resolutions. So it's the best politics and policy and linking up to the minutiae of the budgetary process. So I'm delighted to award this year's prize to Phil Joyce.
I spend a lot of time these days thinking about the mess that is the federal budget. It's hard to be in Washington and not sort of think about that, and the presidential campaign is not terribly illuminating in this regard. I wondered what advice Wildavsky might have for us, and either in sort of helping us to get out of this predicament or helping us understand why we're there. Certainly, I think it is clear that the problems that we have are not mainly technical or institutional, even though we spend a lot of our time thinking about those things, and they're important things to think about. I think our crisis is a crisis in our politics. And it's most clearly manifested in our inability to come to grips with what is, I think, the sort of basic budgeting problem, which is the side and the spending side of the budget get on better speaking terms with each other. And they're not on very good speaking terms right now in the case of the federal budget. I went back first. I thought I would read some of Wildavsky's work again. I went back to the original Politics of the Budgetary Process. It doesn't say a lot about deficits, because in 1964 deficits were not considered to be that important a thing to think about necessarily. What I directly on what Roy said is that this is a work that was informed and talking to people who did things and figuring out, based on what they did, what lessons we could learn about the politics of budgeting. And I think that is a very important thing for us to keep in mind. But back to the deficit. There was a later Wildavsky work with Joe White called The Deficit in the Public Interest. I found an interesting quote in there, and it was, "The deficit is seen as a test of Americans' ability to govern themselves." So I would ask, how are we doing? And I think the answer is, we're not doing very well. I will say that White and Wildavsky were a lot kinder to the politicians of 25 years ago than perhaps many of us think they deserve today. So here's another quote. "Politicians have tried very hard to eliminate the deficit. They have been stymied by legitimate disagreements about the national interest and by the overwhelming size of the task." Well, I think the task is not smaller today than it was then. I think the effort is smaller today than it was then. I think we suffer from a general lack of leadership, but lest we be too hard on our political leaders, they also reminded us that the policy rewards of deficit reduction seem too distant and dubious to be worth the immediate pain. So here's a question for us. What would we do to make the immediate pain more tolerable? Well, Wildavsky actually had an idea. More than 30 years ago, he advocated what the IMF or the World Bank would call adoption of a fiscal rule. That is a norm for budgeting, either a constitutional norm or a moral norm. His norm was to suggest that we should have a constitutional amendment that froze spending in place as a percentage of GDP. Now, I'm not necessarily a fan of this particular rule, but I think it does raise a couple of interesting questions. One is that if we say we have a problem, and that problem is the deficit, is there a general consensus among the population that deficits are bad, that deficits are wrong? If you read public opinion polls, it would suggest that people think that deficits are bad. But they do in abstract or in aggregate, not necessarily in specific. That is, they're not against the things that cause deficits, they're just against the deficits themselves. The other sort of interesting thing in reading about Wildavsky's thinking in terms of development of this rule is that the reason that he felt that we needed this rule is because the political process left to its own devices would not give the people what they want. That is, his suggestion was that the people actually want less government than what the political process delivers, and therefore we need a constitutional role to limit the size of government. Maybe that was true in 1981, I'm not sure. I don't think it's true today. I think what we have today actually is sort of a different issue. It's not that we don't have a norm, it's that we have one, but that norm is one where people are demanding two things: low taxes and high spending. So that norm could be sort of put, if we wanted to put it in terms of a kind of position, it would be, we would like more government than we are willing to pay for. There is no magic bullet. And if what Jim was talking about, the sort of work that I've done, talking about institutions, talking about processes, one of the things that I think comes through time and again is that people want to look for the simple rule that's going to get us out of our problems. When I worked at CBO, I used to say that every member of Congress knew what was wrong with the budget process. They didn't agree on what was wrong with the budget process, but they knew what was wrong with it. And then they believed that the next idea they had must be the solution. But the problem is that there is no single optimal budget outcome. There's no one best way to organize a budget process. There's no way to get the budget process to get us out of what is essentially a political problem. Budgeting is always going to be a work in progress because democracy is always a work in progress. Now, lest that be considered to be a sort of negative kind of downer thing to say, let me say it's a good thing for those of us in this room. Because this is full employment for future Wildavsky Award winners, many of whom I see before me. So I'll close there. If any of you thought that I had the answers, and most of you know me well enough to know that I do not, and I want to thank you. I am disappointed. I want to thank Jim, Bart, Dennis, and Jerry. I want to thank the past award winners, many of whom are in this room. You have been an inspiration to all of us who study public budgeting and financial management. The group, if you read it, is virtually a who's who of all of the people who have been exemplary role models in the study of budgeting and financial management. And finally, I have lots of friends in this room, and I have lots of friends in the profession, and I'm quite hesitant to start naming names because I'm going to leave somebody out invariably. But I've been lucky enough to meet an awful lot of lifelong friends in my time working in budgeting, and especially since I have been associated with ABFM. I will be presumptuous enough to just say you know who you are. And I also want to say that I really appreciate how much fun you have made this for me so far, and I look forward to our continuing the journey together. So thank you very much.